and great nation knows how we have tried to show goodwill to the extent to where that some might have blamed us or found it strange that we showed so much patience. And how we responded to what we responded to, despite the fact that it did not show weakness, and to show that the motives of the two administrations, the British and the American, aided by the Zionist administration, presenting new pretexts every day since the ceasefire in 1991 until the war that started today. Those decisive days which we live today, and where the Mujahideen and the great people of Iraq are contributing and showing their bravery, that they deserve the victory from God Almighty as was promised against the enemies of God and humanity. And we are entitled to. It's our duty to be proud, as the believers should be, to the heroic deeds that is being demonstrated by our great heroes today. We have always responded, even when we were asked to do things that they were illegitimate. So the sanctions and the blockade on our nation would be lifted. And after they run out of excuses and pretexts, the invaders came to reveal their true colors and showing their real intention, their evil intentions, which was not surprising to us. And you know, brothers, that it's always been our aim to avoid evil, but when evil comes to us armed with the sword of destruction, then we have no choice. Today you're standing, oh, you glorious Iraqis, men and women, and you heroes in our armed forces. Today you're standing in a position that would please the friend and would anger the enemy and all the infidels. But you will be victorious against your enemies, and you are causing them to suffer. You rely on your God, and now it's clear to everyone that the aggression and the unjust is clear to everyone. In 1991, the aggression against our nation, the victory is soon. These decisive days, O you Iraqis, are in line with what God has ordered you, to cut their throats. And those who are the believers will be victorious. These decisive days, the enemy tried not using missiles and fighter jets as they did before. This time they sent their infantry troops. This time they have come to invade and occupy your land. And if the American and the British in this battle, they've been avoiding to meet you face to face, and they've been using their fighters in most cases. These forces this time has invaded our land, and everywhere it goes, it faces resistance. And every time it advances and leaves the desert behind it, it finds the Iraqis surrounding it and opening fire and resisting it. The members of the party and the tribes and the Fidayeen and the armed forces, everyone has been heroic in their resistance. Therefore, after they underestimated you Iraqis, now they've come on land. This attempt is our chance to incur losses on them. They are in a dilemma. They are in trouble now. Hit them and strike them, you Mujahideen, heroes. Strike against your enemy with fear. You great Iraqi, inspired by the spirit of jihad that you have, and strike them until they come to the conclusion that they're not in a position to continue with their crimes against you and against humanity. And then you will have your stability, pride, and victory. And to our martyrs, who will be rewarded with paradise. As for you, you will be rewarded by God, and the lesson that you are teaching to the enemy will make him hesitant, unable after that to dare to challenge you or challenge humanity again. Strike them and strike evil, so evil will be defeated, and all those mothers will be able to sleep in peace. All those fathers and children that have been terrorized by the aggression, and all the eyes of the great people will sleep in peace, and your deeds and your jihad will send them back in disappointment and despair. And to the Arabs and to all great people around the world, we promise you what We have been promised by God in our struggle with the enemies of humanity that God will support his soldiers and they will be defeated and humiliated. We will continue with our pact with God, and he is our witness, and the faithful around the world, that we are prepared to sacrifice everything we have to please him so he can support his soldiers, and we rely on him to humiliate the aggressors, the arrogant, and to disperse them and to turn their evil on them. We, alongside the soldiers of God in our land, after putting our faith in God and preparing what we can to achieve this victory, the Iraqi Mujahideen are causing the enemy to suffer and to lose every day, and as time goes they will lose more, and they will not be able to escape lightly from their predicament. We will make it as painful as we can against the enemy, so they will be defeated and choked and terrified before the faith which is endorsed by God. The resistance that has been bestowed on us by God Almighty on our land. It's my duty to salute in your name, you great Iraqis, your armed forces, and all the resistance groups, all in their fields. And when I name the names of those fighting and those great leaders, I mention every soldier that is prepared to give his life to protect the principles and the great values and the faith that has been granted to us by God. And the nation and the country will be safe, and the people will be proud. I say with fear of God in my heart that my pride in you is without limits to all those great people on the land of Iraq. I'm honored to mention the infantry brigade, the men of Al-Qadisiyya and the mother of all battles. Their steadfastness and their heroic deeds are a source of pride to all of us. The 11th Brigade, I namely mention column 45 and the brigade that has been fighting in Qasr and doing us great honor. And I would like to name some names of those people who have distinguished themselves, the leader of the 11th Brigade, Mustafa Muhammad Umran Al-Azzawi, and the chief Bashir Ahmed Uthman, and commander of the 45th Brigade, Ali Khalil Ibrahim, and the commander from the 45th Brigade, Yahya Badri Dakhil, and commander from the 45th Brigade, Colonel Muhammad Khalaf al-Juburi, commander from 45th Brigade, Colonel Fathi Ghani Majid.
وقد تجحفل بإمرة اللواء الخامس والأربعين البطل فوج خفر السواحل
and
وآمره
the
المقدم
border guards
الركن هيثم
and
رشيد
their commander Haytham
أحمد
Rashid
البدران
Ahmad al-Badran,
وآمر الفوج الثالث للواء السابع والأربعين
and the
من
commander of
الفرقة الحادية عشرة المقدم
11th column,
الركن
Colonel
خالد محمد كسار
Khalid Muhammad Kassar, and I'll salute in your name
قائد الفيلق الثالث
the commander
الفريق
of
الركن
the
نوري
3rd
داود
Division,
مشعل
Nuri Dawood
العويدي
Mishal
قائد
Al-Awaidi,
الفرقة الحادية والخمسين
and the commander
في
of
الفيلق الثالث
Brigade
اللواء الركن
51,
خالد حاتم صالح الهاشمي
General Khalid
وقائد
Al-Hashimi,
الفرقة المدرعة السادسة
and the leader of the 6th Brigade,
أعجبي برع
General
أحمد الخطاب
Ahmad
الناصري
Al-Khattab Al-Nasri,
وقائد
and the
الفرقة
commander
الثامنة عشر
of the
اللواء
18th
الركن عادل عبد
column,
الله غثوان
General Adil Abdullah Ghathwan Al-Ghrairi,
وقائد القوة البحرية اللواء البحري
and the commander of the Marine Force,
حسن
Colonel
وإلى الأعداء أقول
Mahmoud Hassan, and to the enemies I say we have met what we have been promised by God Almighty. So what have you found? You are the disciples of the devil. And I say to our beloved in Basra, I say to them, patience, brothers, victory is imminent. And I say to you and to the people of beloved Baghdad and Mosul, the great city, city of weapons and swords, and to our people, people of Muthanna, I say to them, patience, brothers. You know too, and you all know, the people of Dikar, the people of civilization and principles. You all know that the enemy that will tighten and increase its bombardment every time you resist him on the ground. So be patient, brothers and beloved ones. Be patient and God will grant you victory. I say to all of you that the enemies, every time they're defeated before you, forces on the ground, they will increase their bombardment. So be patient. your position
ومكانتكم عند الله
and your
كبيرة إن شاء الله
status
وأن
with God
خفاف صبركم سيكون النصر.
is superior, and you will have victory. God is great.
الله أكبر وعاشت أمتنا
God is
المجيدة.
great, and long live our victorious nation.
حرة
Long live
عربية
Palestine, free and Arab,
إلى البحر.
from the river to the
وعاش
sea.
العراق.
And long live
عاش
Iraq.
العراق.
Long live Iraq.
عاش العراق.
Long live Iraq,
بلد الجهاد
the country of jihad
والفضيلة.
and virtue.
وعاش العراقيون.
And long live the
رمز
Iraqis,
للجهاد والعز
symbol of
والأمل
jihad,
والأمن
proud hope and security and humanity.
وتحية
And
إلى كل الذين تضامنوا
best
مع
regard
شعبنا.
to all those who showed solidarity with our people in this
وتبا
encounter.
للأشرار الغزاة
And
وأعوانهم ومن أوصاهم بالشر.
Disgrace to the evil and their friends and those who have listened to evil.
الله أكبر. الله أكبر.
God is great.
وليخزى الخاسئون.
You have been listening to a statement made by President Saddam Hussein of Iraq. A lot to talk about here. Let's bring in Christian Amanpour and Darren Kagan, who are joining us from Kuwait City.
And before you guys begin to speak, we want to welcome our international viewers because we're now being simulcast on CNNI.
Christian, what did you take away from this?
Well, this is a very current speech. Obviously, I think there can be no doubt that this is A, the real person, and B, the person responding to events that have been going on in the last 24 hours at least. He specifically mentioned Qasr, one place which has been, for the last maybe 36 to 48 hours now, the subject of a battle. You know, the U.S. Marines who led the assault on Qasr under command of the British 3rd Commando Unit of the Royal Marines thought that they would take Qasr without much of a fight. It's a tiny little place. Look at it there on your map. It's a very small urban area. It has a very significant port. Anyway, they didn't take it and it's still going on. They believe it's isolated pockets. But this to say that Saddam Hussein has been speaking about current battles, and he went on to talk about the other, quote, setbacks that, quote, the enemy has suffered, and they continue to lose every day, and they will lose even more as they continue every day. He says they will not be able to escape their predicament. We will make their pain as much as possible. And then he went on to talk about and to list the commanders and the senior officers of various brigades. For instance, the 45th Brigade, which is in Qasr, apparently, according to Saddam Hussein. Also, he mentioned a series of others, and notably the 51st Brigade, which was around Basra. Now, interestingly about this, we had been talked to by the military leaders on the US and British side saying that a lot of these brigades and commanders had surrendered. But clearly, while there are significant surrenders, not most, but certain amounts of resistance continue, and they are there harassing the US and UK troops. And this proceeds up to Nasiriyah and elsewhere, as I said, also around Basra. In short, Darren, I think he was rallying his troops. He appeared much calmer, and his people much calmer, much more in control than the first speech that was broadcast several hours after the invasion started. And of course, with troops allegedly closing in on Baghdad, he's out there trying to rally them and trying to get them to keep up the fight, mentioning over and over again the issue of mujahideen, jihad, really appealing to the religious element in this as well.
A couple of other points I want to get you to comment on. First of all, looked a lot different than that first speech. In his military uniform, wasn't wearing the big, thick glasses that he was the first time. I think trying to give an image of appearing as a strong leader rather than the first time where he looked a little bit more worried, I think.
Well, I think so. And people who've been watching or already, you could see reaction coming out that this is a calmer, more in control Saddam Hussein. And I think also interesting, remembering the speeches he gave during the first Gulf War. And by the way, he commended one of the Al-Qaeda brigades, talking about how they are responding heroically, quote, in this battle, and mentioning how they responded heroically in the mother of all battles, which is the Iraqi leaders' name for the Gulf War back in 1991. But yeah, he spoke a lot about the to his people to be patient, that the enemy will increase the bombardment as our soldiers resist them on the ground. He was telling them to keep patient and prepared and to keep sort of strong in the face of massive bombardment, which he said would continue. But again, in the Gulf War, it was much more full of bravado. We will win, we have won everywhere, this is, you know, the Allies are doing nothing. Here he's acknowledging that they're moving forward. He said as they leave the desert behind them, so he's acknowledging that they're moving forward, and but he's saying that they're still putting up heroic resistance. And indeed, there has been significant resistance over the last 24 hours.
And also, as you and I were sitting here watching it, one thing we were trying to figure out, is it live, is it tape, as we did the first time when we saw the first tape, but perhaps not as significant in that because he did give clues of current events.
Yeah.
Perhaps this was taped, even though the Rocky TV put up live, but clearly it would appear that Saddam Hussein is alive and in control of his country.
It seems so, and certainly from, I mean, it's really difficult for us here to make any kind of definitive judgment like that, but certainly there's been so many contradictory briefings by intel from the Allied side over the last several days. Was he injured? Was he not? Was he dead? Was he alive? So this is all going to fill in some of those clues to this big puzzle. And interestingly, a lot of this war is about psychological pressure. How many times have we been briefed that the war is aimed, for instance, to consolidate territory, to liberate towns, let's say in the south, to send a serious message to Baghdad that, look, we, US, UK, are in charge of this part. It's time now for you to step down and get the message. Well, a lot of that is going according to schedule, but there are these pockets of resistance, and it's not going as easily as perhaps some, maybe not the senior commanders, but some others were briefing reporters.
Had predicted or had hoped.
Yeah.
Originally, Saddam Hussein. Yes, go ahead.
This is Carol Costello. You know, I was struck by the fact, Christiane and Darren, that no mention of the American POWs was made, and of course many Americans are very concerned about them. Saddam said a lot of stuff like this. He said, we will make it as painful as we can against them. What was he specifically referring to, do you think?
Well, I think the resistance. I mean, there have been American casualties over the last 24 hours, particularly around Nasiriyah in south central on the Euphrates there, even to the point where some of those POWs, we understand, were captured to the rear, on some of the supply lines. And so that indicates that they are at least managing to mount certain harassment tactics, if you like. They're coming around. All the pockets of resistance have not been neutralized as this big force pushes up from the south and up to the north. They're going so fast. Today, one military spokesman suggested that perhaps they're going so fast and they're trying to avoid certain urban areas for obvious reasons, but perhaps that's making them unable to neutralize all the opposition. And Saddam specifically mentioned the Fedayeen. We've heard a lot over the last several months and even years about so-called Saddam's Fedayeen. They're often shown on television parading in their white shrouded uniforms, and this is a specific volunteer group that has been set up, you know, as one of the sort of close protection guards. So perhaps what's going on, and certainly what the British were talking to us about as their area of operations is in southeast Iraq, they're also meant to be trying to protect the American flank. As the Americans move up from the south and move on up to Nasiriyah and Baghdad eventually, the British are meant to be trying to make two protective measures. One up north near one of the rivers, the Tigris, and one to the rear to protect the American flank. But that takes time, and they haven't all got up in position yet.
I'd like you to comment on some of the language that we heard, because I think it would be interpreted differently in different parts of the world, either here in the Middle East or back in the States. One, some of the language using, we're going to make this as painful as we can. Also using language, Iraq will strike the necks of the enemy as God has commanded you. That's very strong language that will be interpreted differently in the United States than it would be here in the Middle East.
Perhaps, but it's part of the
Bravado.
language of this particular style. I mean, he's used that significantly in the past. I think, again, he's used the religious references significantly as well. And you can see that the Iraqi flag was in fact changed during the first Gulf War. It used never to have Allahu Akbar in the center of the flag, and it has had that for the last 12 years. God is great. It's, you know, their attempt to appeal to the greater Arab public, as you saw when he signed off, long live Iraq, but long live Palestine. And certainly there are many, many people around the world who did not believe in this war, not too much sympathy for Saddam Hussein's regime, but many, many people around the world, and particularly around the Arab world, are very concerned about the Iraqi people and, you know, the traditional sort of anti-war
Sure, and
feelings.
as you said, his reference to Palestine, also his references to jihad.
Indeed, indeed. Iraq, the country
Yeah,
of jihad. This is all language that's been appropriated, if you like, in the last 12 years, and for a very specific reason, and of course it resonates. Particularly, and let's say it again, at a time when the Arab-Israeli problem, the Palestine-Israeli problem, is at a very, you know, high peak. And of course, we're not hearing much about that right now because this situation has taken over pretty much wall-to-wall coverage. But they're appealing, obviously, to that. But I think in general, the point is, here he is, rallying his people, looking as far as we can gather, all right, and being very complimentary and talking about his heroic soldiers, listing many people by name. And again, as they get closer to Baghdad, you know, is trying to rally the people and the troops.
It will be what the United States is talking about as it wakes up. This is the middle of the night in the United States, and of course at different times all around the world, but it is the next development in this war.
Not the middle of the night around the world.
No.
People are looking
Well,
now, I'm
right
sure.
now here in Kuwait, it's
Quarter to midday.
coming up on noon.
Yeah.
The timing interesting on when he chose to address his people and also the people here in the Middle East and around the world. Christiane Amanpour, thank you so much.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Back to you.
All right, back to us. We're going to have much more on Saddam Hussein's speech. Some of the interesting points about it, there were those strange camera switches during the broadcast. We couldn't really figure out what that was about. It looked as if it were taped, but we don't know.
Right. I was actually talking to some of the technical people during the speech, saying that clearly there were two cameras and some sort of switching machine that allowed them to switch back and forth rather primitively between those two camera positions. It seemed the cameras were rather close together. There was a slight sync problem, I was told, as the cameras switched back and forth. One person just sort of their own personal opinion saying that it was either some sort of in the field switching machine, therefore not a very high-tech one, or just shoddy equipment. So
yeah, we just don't know. And if we could put up those pictures of the contrast between Saddam Hussein, who supposedly spoke today, and the Saddam Hussein who spoke Thursday, we did notice a great difference between the two.
Well, yeah, clearly, and as Christiane pointed out, the image that we first saw soon after the coalition, the first coalition bombing, that decapitation strike. I mean, again, it's largely personal take, but you viewers can judge for yourself.
Yeah, decide for yourself. And Christiane Amanpour has one more important point to make, so let's go back to Kuwait City and Christiane. Christiane.
Well, again, in his speech, he did go on at some length about telling the people of the world and the people of Iraq that, look, we have done everything that's been asked of us. He was obviously referring to cooperating with the weapons inspectors. We've done everything possible that was asked of us. Of course, the US and British would disagree with that, but nonetheless, trying to say that we've done everything, even to the point of things that were not legitimate to ask of a sovereign nation, hoping that the sanctions would be lifted over the last 12 years. And then he said, you know, when the Allies, or he didn't call them the Allies, when the UK and British run out of, quote, pretext, then they invaded and they came in with this military action. And he said to the people, remember last time it was about bombing and fighter jets, but this time they are going to use all their force because they are coming to take and occupy your land. So making a difference between what happened 12 years ago and what happened this time, and trying to put the reasonable face of the Iraqi regime forward by saying at length that we have cooperated, we've done everything they asked us to do.
And Christiane, one more point. I know I keep bringing up the POWs, the American prisoners of war, but a lot of people in America are very concerned about them. Did it surprise you at all that he did not mention them in his speech?
I don't know how to prejudge what he would say. You know, I'm sure a lot of people hope to hear about that. do we know exactly when this speech was recorded? No.
It could be a day. I mean, some of the references you're making would show that he was current, but it could be a day or two old. Who knows?
Could be.
Could be. All right.
And if we were to try to adjust to make the prediction of we knew how this man thought, I mean, there have been books and books,
Difficult.
and a lot of people around the world trying to figure that out about what he chooses to say and not say.
Certainly so. Darren Kagan, Christiane Amanpour reporting live from Kuwait City. Some breaking news. Go ahead.
We also just want to thank our international viewers for joining us. And go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just going to say we have breaking news in other parts of Iraq to get to, but...
Right. We're going to join shortly with Walter Rogers, who is with the 7th Cavalry in southern Iraq. He's on the right-hand side of the screen there, you see on a video phone, and Kevin Sides on the left-hand side of the screen in northern Iraq. Really, first we're going to go to Walter Rogers.
We just lost Walter Rogers, so shall we go to Kevin Sites in northern Iraq? Because he has heard some, what have you heard, Kevin? Why don't you tell us?
Hi, yes, I'm in Cham-Chamal, that's midway between Salmania and Kirkuk, and our Peshmerga sources, those are the Kurdish fighters that we've been working with here and that have been a source of information for us, say about an hour and 45 minutes ago, 8 bombs fell on this frontline position, 8 bombs hitting these Iraqi positions, which we're just about 1,000 meters from. Now, they say that they saw the bombs actually hit, and that they saw Iraqis moving injured soldiers down the mountain, away from the ridgeline, away from some of the exposed areas. Now, we're looking at this right now, and Bill, I don't know, can you zoom in from where we're at? Some of these Iraqi positions that we're looking at look like they're untouched, but they actually may be, the bombs may have hit on the other side of the ridgeline. Right now, it's kind of a windy and rainy day here, so you can't see any smoke left. But our Peshmerga sources say that basically there was a huge rumbling, and in fact we were midway between Salamania and Cham-Chamal here, and we could actually hear the explosions. We had to take a trip to Salamania, and we're on our way back when the explosions happened, and you could hear the rumbling that far away. So obviously there was some movement there. Now, what this may signify, what the significance is here, is that perhaps this is the beginning to soften these front Iraqi defensive positions. They're not heavily fortified as far as what we can see. They have a couple of Dushka machine guns up there. They're Russian-made machine guns. They're heavy machine guns. They had some tanks in these positions probably a week ago, but the Peshmerga said that those tanks had pulled back maybe further to the defensive positions in Kirkuk. But if this is indeed an air campaign beginning to soften up these initial front lines, maybe they're hoping that the Iraqi positions will fall back closer to Kirkuk, and maybe a larger offensive will begin shortly. But as far as we can see, the Iraqi soldiers are still in these hills. There was some, obviously, some hits, since the Peshmerga say that they did see injured soldiers being brought down from the lines. We can't necessarily see any bomb damage from where we're at right now, but perhaps this is just the beginning. They said it was about 8 explosions, and perhaps there'll be some more to come. Back to you. As
far as coalition forces are concerned, Kevin, do you have any information about whether there were any injuries or casualties in the coalition?
Well, at this point, the Iraqis have not been firing back on this location. I think they're basically scrambling to assess, what's happened to them right now. There hasn't been any firing on this side. But in terms of coalition forces coming into the area, there are reports last night that reports that actually moved on the wires last night, but that American soldiers may have come in transport planes near Salamania, on those airstrips near Salamania, to assist the Peshmerga in possibly taking on a couple of fronts against the Iraqis here in Cham-Chamal, and possibly also another front against the Ansar Islam. That's the fundamentalist group that Secretary of State Colin Powell says is the Al-Qaeda link to the Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein. So they may go ahead and attack on 2 fronts. Now, those Ansar al-Islam strongholds have been hit by U.S. bombs for 2 nights in a row. So those positions are being softened up, possibly for a Peshmerga attack against them in the coming days. Now, this is the first time these frontline positions where we're at have actually been hit with bombing. We've been here, probably going on 5 days now, a few days before the war began, and there has not been any kind of bombing against this frontline position in Chamchamal. The Iraqis have fired some mortars in the direction of Chamchamal and some heavy machine gun fire, but so far there's been no return fire from this side, from the Peshmerga. Now, if this is indeed a U.S. bombing raid against these frontline positions, it may signify the beginning of the campaign to roll back these Iraqi defenses towards Kirkuk and begin a campaign for that city in earnest. That is the oil-rich city of Kirkuk, which is such a strategic and important stronghold for U.S. forces to get control of those oil wells and that city actually before the possibility of them actually being damaged or blown up, as Saddam Hussein did after the first Gulf War. The last thing they'd like to see here is those oil wells going up in flames. That would be a serious problem for them. Back to you.
Certainly so. Kevin Seitz reporting live from northern Iraq.
And now we are going to go to southern Iraq, where Walt Rogers is with the 7th Cavalry, and he joins us now. Walter, what's the latest where you are?
Hello, Anderson. It has been a frustrating 24 hours for the U.S. Army's 3rd Squadron, 7th Cavalry. Frustrating because they're having a difficult time getting to the battle, or at least getting north to Baghdad. The commander of this unit said yesterday he expected to be across a certain line. In point of fact, the 7th Cavalry is exactly where it was yesterday. One of the reasons for the difficulty in moving forward is that the Iraqi units, which we are facing in a city north of here, not very far north, but they are using civilians as human shields. We know they moved civilians into areas that the Army, the cavalry, would like to have pushed through yesterday. They couldn't do that because there were civilians present. We went out on a scouting party earlier this morning, very early, with the tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, which you see behind me. We were looking for a different lane, an alternate route around this major population center. We were wandering around. We crossed a railroad track. When we went through the railroad track, we virtually entered the Mesopotamian Delta. Unlike the desert you see me in now, that area was lush with wheat fields and date palm trees. It looked like the 7th Cav had found a route around this Iraqi city. We were walking around, and suddenly we started taking RPG, rocket-propelled grenades. Great big bangs all around us. CNN crew dived for the car. We heard small arms fire. People were literally shooting at us. They were apparently, however, targeting the Army's tanks and Bradleys. 2 Bradleys, or 1 Bradley and 1 tank, saw RPG rounds going whizzing right by them, and we were right next to those tanks. We got out of there, scrambled very quickly. The Army stayed, and they returned small arms fire. That is, the machine guns atop the tanks. The light machine guns, the 7.62, they were able to kill the Iraqis who sneaked up and were firing on the U.S. Army tanks. But what's important about this is we saw where the RPGs came from, and the Iraqi soldiers who were using those rocket-propelled grenades against the American tanks were literally hiding in the civilian houses in this farming agricultural area. The farmers were out in the yard waving, "Hello, how are you?" to the Americans, and suddenly the Iraqi soldiers started firing from the civilian houses on the U.S. Army. Again, no American casualties, but what's happened now is the Army has decided not to send the tanks into that city. Rather, an infantry brigade has been called up. They will clear a lane through the city for the tanks to move through later. Back to you, Anderson.
Walter, just so I'm clear, I believe 24 hours ago or so when we spoke, we saw a plume of smoke from an artillery barrage to some forward Iraqi positions. Are you basically in the same spot you were 24 hours ago? And is this the same group who you had encountered, who the Army, 7th Cav had encountered 24 hours or so ago?
Yes, that's essentially true. the cavalry's problem is that it can get through town if it shoots its way through town, but that's not according to military doctrine. The U.S. military doctrine is when you find a situation like that where you have an Iraqi or hostile force ahead of you, you bring in the infantry, and it's taken that long to get the infantry up to clear the way through for the tanks, because there's some very congested areas there. But yes, in point of fact, we are no more than a few miles away from where we were yesterday, and we have not advanced forward. Anderson?
Walter, you may be unaware of this. We just heard a statement from Iraqi President Saddam Hussein, who basically said that the U.S. has underestimated the resistance they were going to face, and that by coming on land, he said, quote, "it's our chance to incur losses on coalition forces." What he did not mention is that they are essentially, as you report, using Iraqi civilians as human shields. How frustrating is this for the 7th Cavalry? And I assume they have some sort of plan in place, but talk a little bit about how the objective becomes all the more difficult because of the tactics, the very irregular tactics that the Iraqi forces are using.
Well, I suspect it's frustrating, but it does not come as a surprise to the U.S. commanders in the field. They've always known that the Iraqis would employ civilians to shield themselves. And as I say this morning, when we were out on a scouting mission with tanks and tanks and Bradleys, an RPG unit, rocket-propelled grenade unit, was literally hiding in some farmhouses while the farmers were outside waving, feigning friendliness. So that is difficult. Anderson?
So the civilians weren't just having to stand by; they were actively waving, trying to get a sense that everything was clear. Is that what you're saying?
It's difficult to judge their motives, but at one point in this very same area, a young Iraqi fellow came up to me. I greeted him in a few phrases of Arabic. He said, "I speak English," and I was a little surprised. And he began chatting me up, started saying, "Saddam's no good. Saddam must go." But you don't really know who this fellow was. And then there was a Bradley team right beside me, an Bradley fighting vehicle, about 20 or 30 yards back, and he started walking over toward them. I didn't know who this young Iraqi was, young man about 18 or 20 years old. So I stood in front of him and told him, "Don't go over there." I said, "Ana Safafa, I'm a journalist." But I made it clear to him that those were soldiers, and they didn't want him walking up to their vehicle. He could have, the soldiers certainly would have prevented him from doing that, maybe even shot him. So I ran him off, but you don't know who that fellow was. You don't know what his intentions were. He could have been an Iraqi soldier in civilian clothes. He could have been there possibly as a suicide bomber. You don't know how friendly the civilian population is here. But I must say, when we crossed into the Mesopotamian Delta, saw those green fields, irrigation ditches, and the palm trees, it reminded you of Southeast Asia. Anderson?
Walter, you've been with a lot of troops over the years, I imagine. How impressed are you, or what sense do you get of how much U.S. forces, and particularly the 7th Cav, who you're with, how much are they taking into account the fact that there are civilians nearby, and how much does that affect how they are operating in this region?
Well, they are very frustrated and limited in their maneuverability and in their the action which is available to them because of the civilians which are in this region. There is a very substantial population center not far from where the 7th Cavalry is. 7th Cavalry was trying to move through that population center northward because there were the city was the best way north. You really can't flank it for reasons we can't go into at this point. And every time the Iraqis embed with their civilians. It's difficult, but it does not come as a surprise. Every military planner, from the Pentagon down to the soldiers in the field, has been fully aware of this. As a matter of fact, before we launched out, one soldier, I think it was a sergeant back in Kuwait, said to me his biggest concern after gas warfare, if Saddam went to chemical weapons, the sergeant said his biggest concern was that the Iraqis would use human shields as the Army tried to roll through, because the Army is very concerned and has taken great training and great precautions to see this didn't happen or that civilians aren't killed. The Americans have gone out of their way, realizing that in the court of world public opinion they would be instantly condemned the second civilians are killed. As I say, they're very sensitive to this, but there's not a lot they can do about it if the Iraqis, particularly the Fedayeen units, the elite units that Saddam has sent south, at least the officers, if they decide to use those, the United States Army has yet to show any inclination to go in and kill civilians just to achieve a military objective. Anderson?
Walt Rogers, it is really interesting to hear from you, especially so soon after we have just heard from Iraqi President Saddam Hussein, who during his speech praised members of the Fedayeen, the group you're talking about, the group called Men of Sacrifice. He called them heroic. Certainly it seems that part of their heroic tactics, to use his terminology, are to use civilians to protect themselves and try to harass U.S. forces. Walter Rogers, thanks very much with the 7th Cav. Stay safe. Carol?
Another of our correspondents who has seen heavy action, Carl Penhall, who was embedded with a helicopter attack unit. Carl, are you there? Carl Penhall, can you hear me? All right, good. You are in southern Iraq along the Euphrates River. And tell us about Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard and what was that like for American troops. Go ahead.
Carol, I'm with the 2nd Marines, and they are in southern Iraq along the Euphrates River. The unit I'm with, Light Armored Reconnaissance, is actually a blocking force for others moving north. They're not far from some of the action that we have seen and heard about in recent days, the 10 Marines killed in Al Nazariya. They have found, interestingly, not Republican Guards here, but reserve officers and troops from the Army. A number of them surrendered last night. Actually, I was with them when, and we have just heard a cannon, some artillery go off. Unclear what that was, but I can tell you the Light Lieutenant Colonel just surrendered along with a couple of officers and military intelligence that he had 175 men in this area, and when the war began, only 35 showed up. He did not have much stomach for it and surrendered last night. His wife and children kissed him goodbye at a little mud hut not far from here along the Euphrates, and with his herds of sheep, he climbed onto a light armored vehicle with the Marines and myself, and rode back to speak with Marine military intelligence, and they have been talking to him ever since. The unit did see action last night. A unit, light armored vehicle on patrol, encountered 2 Iraqi soldiers, regular soldiers in uniform with AK-47s. They were in an area like Walter described, very lush across the river, totally different than the sandy area to our south, much like Southeast Asia. Rice farmers, and they were hiding apparently at a house. Farmers in the area, they came up to the road, looked like they were looking at a light armored vehicle with this other unit that was hiding, and when they got onto the road and started walking towards it, this commander took his LAV up onto the road. They raised their weapons, as he described to me, and they were taken out with 2 short bursts of 7.62 machine gun fire from the Marines. They sent up 2 smoke flares after that to locate the bodies, and they were buried just a little while ago. Carol, I was standing nearby. They're very, very respectfully. 2 holes, grave sites dug side by side, and the men were laid in them. One was buried with his shoes on and a canteen, the other barefoot with cigarettes still in his pocket. I just spoke to the commander of the vehicle who had the firefight, and he said that he was just acting on muscle memory. The training that he got as a Marine, helped him keep his composure and get the job done. Carol?
Art Harris, I apologize for throwing to Carl Penhall when it was Deed you're up. Can you has the unit that you're with seen the use of human shields?
Not yet, Carol. What they have seen as a blocking force and as they are guarding this very key area and bridge along the Euphrates is that many civilians or civilians who appear to be civilians are coming over the bridge with military uniforms in bags, in sacks. They are being stopped and searched, and yesterday I counted 57 Iraqis who were taken to a holding area behind in concertina wire, given water, some food, and they were interviewed by